Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely epic story, and it's one that's honestly been hiding right in plain sight within the pages of history. We are tracking the incredible journey of human speech, our inner perception, and specifically, the physical tongue. This is the story of how our capacity to understand reality and speak the truth was fundamentally broken, and how it was ultimately and spectacularly restored. So let's kick things off with a massive question, one that completely shifts how we view one of the most famous events in human history, Pentecost. When the Holy Spirit was poured out, inaugurating this brand new era, why did the Spirit choose the tongue as the very first organ to be transformed? I mean, really think about it. Why were tongues of fire resting over their heads and foreign speech coming from their mouths the very first outward signs? Why not hands for healing, or feet for traveling? Well, to understand why the physical tongue was the absolute centerpiece of this whole event, we actually have to completely rethink what it means to be a prophet. We really need to bust a modern myth right here. Today, I think most people just assume a prophet is basically a fortune teller, someone who predicts the future. But biblically, that is way, way too narrow. A prophet is fundamentally a human being who faithfully perceives God's reality and then communicates it truthfully. In fact, if you go all the way back to before the fall, humanity's original vocation in the Garden of Eden was deeply prophetic. Adam walked with God, he received divine revelation, he understood reality perfectly from God's perspective, and he spoke truthful words. Now, when we look at the historical arc of human speech, we see this tragic decline followed by an incredible rescue mission. At creation, we have beautiful, creative speech. Adam naming the animals perfectly wasn't just him making up categories. It was a profound act of authority, discernment, and speaking in total alignment with divine reality. But then the fall happens, and speech gets corrupted into lies, blame, and manipulation. This corruption then reaches its absolute climax at the Tower of Babel, resulting in rebellious speech, where a single, unified language was actually weaponized for collective rebellion. And that whole downward spiral brings us to Pentecost, where speech is finally redeemed. But it begs the question, why did our speech break in the first place? Well, it really boils down to two trees, and these trees represent two entirely different ways of knowing. The tree of life represents knowledge received through communion, dependence, and participation with God. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that represents knowledge through autonomy and self-determination. You see, the fallen Eden wasn't just a simple moral failure. It was an epistemological revolution. What I mean is, humanity decided they wanted to write the rulebook of reality all by themselves. They chose to construct and interpret reality completely independent of God. And the moment they changed their source of truth, human perception fundamentally broke. Which brings us to a really crucial concept, the nous. The nous is your inner perceiver of reality. It's the lens through which you interpret truth. And here is the absolutely vital connection. Speech is simply the outward manifestation of how reality is interpreted inwardly. The physical tongue is this precious, incredibly valuable instrument precisely because it broadcasts our inner truth to the outside world. So, if humanity exchanged divine revelation for self-determination, the nous collapsed. And if your internal perception of reality is corrupted, well, you literally cannot speak the truth outwardly. It's impossible. Okay, let's dive into this inside-out healing process, because this explains exactly why the tongue was the very first thing transformed at Pentecost. The Holy Spirit had to first heal human perception before the tongue could physically speak truthfully again. Look at the sequence here. Step 1, the Spirit is poured out. Step 2, the heart is renewed. Step 3, the nous, that inner perception we just talked about, is healed by having the veil removed. And finally, step 4, that fully healed perception naturally and immediately overflows into renewed prophetic speech. There is honestly no better illustration of a healed nous than the Apostle Peter. Just think about Peter before Pentecost. The guy was practically famous for putting his foot in his mouth out of fear and confusion. He constantly misunderstood Jesus' mission. But after the Spirit is poured out, sudden, profound clarity. The man with the foot in his mouth suddenly has fire on his tongue. He accurately interprets the Old Testament, he completely understands God's redemptive plan, and he boldly proclaims it. Peter's greatest miracle that day wasn't just speaking in foreign languages, it was that his nous was healed, and he finally perceived reality correctly. And Peter's transformation connects to this deep, ancient longing. All the way back in Numbers chapter 11, Moses cried out, "Oh, that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them." Moses wasn't asking for a bunch of individual fortune tellers, right? He was longing for a universally restored, prophetic humanity. He wanted a world where everyone was empowered by the tongue to speak with true divine authority. This was a promise the prophet Joel later expanded upon, looking toward a day when the Spirit would be poured out on literally everyone, giving them a voice. The Jewish expectation in Acts chapter 2 was exactly this, a universal prophetic empowerment. Now let's do a quick vocabulary check regarding the miracle itself, because there's a fascinating academic distinction here. Xenolalia refers strictly to speaking a known, recognizable human language that the speaker never actually learned naturally. Glossolalia, on the other hand, is just a broader category, meaning tongue speech, which can include unknown or unearthly languages. Acts chapter 2 was very specifically xenolalia. The disciples spoke recognizable national languages like Parthian, Egyptian, and Roman, and they did this deliberately to gather the nations. And this brilliantly illustrates the complete reversal of the Tower of Babel. At Babel, humanity used one single rebellious language to establish an independent identity and engage in unified defiance against God, which of course resulted in them being scattered across the earth. But at Pentecost, unity is created not by one rebellious language, but by one Lord and one Spirit, beautifully expressed through many languages. Pentecost doesn't revert humanity to a single language. Instead, it sanctifies diverse languages to reunite the scattered nations back together. Which leads to a fantastic question. Why didn't God just give everyone a single, unified heavenly language? Or, return us to whatever language Adam spoke in Eden? Well, it's because the gospel incarnates into cultures, exactly as Christ became flesh. The kingdom's goal isn't to just erase human diversity. The Spirit honors human identity. The language you speak is a fundamental part of who you are. The identity brought by tongues here is huge. A Parthian remains a Parthian, a Roman remains a Roman, yet they all confess the exact same Lord. Every single language is now given supreme value, fully sanctified as a worthy vehicle for divine truth. Now, you might be thinking of the Apostle Paul's really famous quote, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels." Does this mean there's some unified angelic language meant to replace human speech? When we actually look at the context of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul is using rhetorical hyperbole. He's saying, if I have all knowledge, if I have all faith, and even if I spoke angelic languages, it's an intentional exaggeration used to exalt the supreme importance of love rather than providing literal proof of an angelic language that's supposed to erase human culture. Now look at how this restoration reveals our ultimate identity as a royal, priestly, and prophetic humanity. Humanity was created with this threefold image-bearing vocation. At Pentecost, all three are completely restored. We proclaim truth as prophets through tongues and bold speech. We live in God's presence as priests, as the church itself becomes the new temple. And we exercise delegated rule as kings by announcing the enthroned Messiah to the world. So the absolute core takeaway is this. The public miracle of tongues, with the visible fire resting over the head and the audible speech pouring from the mouth, proves that humanity's prophetic identity is finally functioning correctly again. The tongue has been rescued. It is entirely redeemed from being an instrument of autonomous pride and division, like we saw at Babel, and transformed back into a beautifully empowered vehicle for worship, thanksgiving, and kingdom proclamation. Let's zoom out for a second and see how this builds across the entire grand narrative of history. In Genesis 1, God speaks creative life into existence. In Genesis 2, Adam speaks in truthful alignment with God. In Acts 2, redeemed humanity speaks the mighty works of God. But look at where it all culminates in the book of Revelation. Creation sings. Speech ultimately and beautifully progresses into song. Why does the Bible move from speech to song? Because while speech communicates and restores truth, song embodies and expresses the absolute fullness of restored communion and heavenly glory. The book of Revelation culminates not just in redeemed speech, but in the awe-inspiring participatory worship of every single tribe, tongue, and nation. The church doesn't manufacture this worship, it gets to join the eternal, joyful chorus of heaven that is already happening. Which actually brings us right back to you and me. We've seen how a renewed nous, a healed inner perception, naturally overflows into the prophetic action of a redeemed tongue. The tongue is literally the steering wheel of the whole person. So if your internal perception of God's truth directly shapes your outward speech, what reality is your tongue building today? Are your words echoing the autonomous rebellion of Babel, or the redeemed, truth-speaking, beautifully diverse chorus of Pentecost? It's a pretty profound thought to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the incredible truths hidden in plain sight.